This episode is brought to you by SoundCloud with Straight Edges. Hello, Earthlings. Welcome to the final in a series of SoundMind vlogs where I have talked about my process behind the 7 songs I performed in my final recital at Berklee College of Music this April. And we've come to the final one. So I guess first off, the name of the piece of mine I'm talking about should be explained, as with any weird but easily explainable title. It comes from 2 of the first things I learned when I took beginning French in high school. One of them was that I am and I follow are both je suis, despite those verbs having completely different conjugations otherwise. So the sentence je suis ce que je suis could have 4 different meanings, depending on which verb you're talking about. I also learned that a casual French speaker could pronounce je suis as just Shwee. So the full title is Shweeska Shwee, I follow what I am what I follow. That's the last time I'm writing a title that convoluted. But on to the actual music. The history of this piece began with something it has no relation to anymore. Don Hertzfeldt's film, It's Such a Beautiful Day. Don Hertzfeldt was the same guy who did that viral cartoon, Rejected. It's Such a Beautiful Day has a similar, but not exactly the same animation style. It incorporates a bit of live footage with no actual people in it, I don't think. He incorporates his stick figure drawings into a more experimental film about a middle-aged guy with mental illness. A mental illness, I should say. Mental illness is not itself a disease, but it immediately inspired me to write a piece based on it as soon as I first finished watching it. I had already written a kind of ending to it that went like this. Everything will be okay. You know I'm so proud of you, and it's such a beautiful day. Imagine that sung by a better singer. And keeping all of that in mind, I wrote a 5-minute piece as my final for Scott Free's Jazz Composition 2 class called It's Such a Beautiful Day Part -1. But the over-concentration on plot led to too many good ideas and not enough development. And then in Greg Hopkins' Jazz Composition 3 class, I stretched it into a 10-minute piece and called it It's Such a Beautiful Day Part 0, with the intention of later adding lyrics and just calling it It's Such a Beautiful Day. By the way, those lyrics I sang there were the names of the 3 sections of the film. Everything Will Be Okay, I'm So Proud of You, and It's Such a Beautiful Day. But once again, there were too many good ideas and not enough development of those ideas in my piece. So when Greg offered the opportunity to revise it for a higher grade, I decided I would just take one of those ideas and flesh it out into its own piece, devoid of any external story, and leave the task of writing a song based on It's Such a Beautiful Day to another composer for the moment. So what actually ended up becoming Shweeska Shwee uses a technique called serialism, or the 12-tone method, or some people say dodecaphonic writing. It was originally devised by the early 20th century Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg as a way of writing atonal music, i.e. music in no key, because he had seen all the music that had eventually led up to him pointing to a complete loss of sense of key in music. As most of the music that came after him proves, he was wrong, but he did leave behind a really interesting alternative method to writing in a key. The foundation of any 12-tone piece is a thing called a tone row, which is kind of like a scale, but it's not exactly a scale, but an order of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, meaning all 12 notes are used in equal measure, and none of them dominates the piece. With that restriction, it forces you to get creative in other areas, like putting notes in different octaves, or putting them together to create chords, or transposing the row, or inverting it, playing it backwards, or some combination of those, or even non-pitch related aspects of the music like the rhythm and the orchestration. But the character of any 12-tone piece often somewhat depends on the structure of the row itself. For example, Alban Berg, a contemporary of Schoenberg's, he liked to give his rows strong tonal implications. For example, the row in his violin concerto is loaded with thirds, which makes it sound like a huge chord. But the row I used is the complete opposite, because it's based on the most dissonant interval in Western music, the tritone. But both rows I just played have highly symmetrical shapes, which make for some interesting patterns within them. The basic pattern of intervals I used repeats every 4 notes, so if you play every 4th note you get an augmented triad, no matter where you start from. Or if you pair up the notes and play each pair together, you get 2 parallel chromatic scales like this. If you play every other note, you get 3 pairs of fifths. Hang on, that sounds like Men at Work. And the weirdest of all is that if you play every 3rd note, you get the bottom of a minor scale. And those things work no matter where in the row you start, because of the symmetry within the row. At this point, I want to thank Ayn Inserto, whom I had a directed study with, because without her guidance, the piece seriously wouldn't be half as good. She apparently has trouble writing short things, and I have trouble writing long things, so I learned a lot from her. Anyway, let's begin at the beginning. The opening burst of noise is something I think of as a salutation, or a fanfare. It's saying, hey, there's a really important riff coming. I took inspiration for this from the opening series of chords in Meeting of the Spirits by the Mahavishnu Orchestra, except there's only one chord here and it's much louder, but it's not related at all to the main riff that will soon appear. It's merely heralding its arrival. In between those two things, Ayn suggested I have the piano tease the riff, adding 1 note at a time. So it starts out with just, and then. The other things the rest of the band is playing during this were added to disguise the beat. If you listen but don't watch me conducting, you have no idea where beat 1 is. The main riff was derived from first transposing the row up a half step, and then I shifted it so it started on the 2nd note. Add some handy-dandy octave displacement. And the James Brown rule, when in doubt, make it funky. And now we've got something you can dance to. And the lowest notes form a kind of bass line, which also suggests a key. That's G, the root, which would make D the 5th. And then we've got the minor 3rd and major 3rd. This makes a nice solid foundation for the first theme to appear over. Again, this theme is just playing the row straight, but this time it's a sax playing 8th notes, which honestly makes any random combination of notes sound like jazz. The baritone sax comes in answering the alto a major 3rd below. That's a technique used by Bartók, a canon in major 3rds that Greg Hopkins loved and encouraged us to use in our pieces in his class. It's kind of handy that my row actually repeats itself every major 3rd. Then we get to a riff which is basically my version of Bleed by Meshuggah. After all this pummeling the listeners with one note, I decided there should be a massive intrusion into the music, like maybe the trumpet line from the second act of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. And I thought, you know what? I'll just steal that line and put it in there. The next big things we get to are the alto sax solo and the guitar solo. I wrote the tone row out on the soloist's music so they could use it as a reference if they were so inclined. And it was interesting to see their different reactions. On the one hand, Sam, the alto player, was really excited to try a slightly different approach to soloing, and when I said you don't have to use the tone row, she said, no, I want to. But I think Joe, the guitarist, was relieved to hear he could just play something sort of in G, because he's really a rocker. He's a guitar god in the making. And it was great to have him follow Sam because of how different the two of them play, but the groove underneath them is the same. Then we get some more of the metal riff, and then the swing section starts. This is based off a slightly different transformation of the row than the initial version I used for the main riff. Basically, this starts the actual row on G, which you don't really hear because the rhythm is the same and the shape is the same. It's just that every other note is different, so instead of this, we get this. The next thing I did was I turned the inversion of the row into a walking bass line, which sounds pretty conventional. It sounds like what jazz musicians sometimes call a cycle 5 or cycle 4 progression. I still haven't worked out the difference between those two. It's just an endless series of dominant chords, and here comes another point where I broke away from the row. I had the horns answering back and forth with arpeggios. And what I wrote was this. Eventually, I resolved the progression in a sort of cheesy, old-school big band swing style. And Ayn suggested I make the tonic chord augmented instead of just a straight major chord, so that the sudden emergence of a key wouldn't be so jarring. It was also her suggestion to make the swing section softer and calmer, because after being relentlessly beaten to death with these two riffs, and you gotta take a breather or you'll pass out. So like with the funk riff, I extracted some 3-note chords from the row, but I put the dissonant notes on the bottom so they wouldn't be so abrasive. And the melody on top in the trumpets comes from the thing I showed you earlier about playing every 3rd note of the row, which gives you the bottom of a minor scale. So the melody has a definite sense of key to it. Even though it comes from the same row that brought you this. The metal riff then comes crashing back in for the tenor sax solo, a thing I had written with Paul Meland in mind. I also kind of had Sam and Joe in mind when I gave them solos, but I knew that Paul could just go crazy and for hours on a thing like this after I saw his band Paracusia, along with Earth Mother, opening for Fordham Road, which Joe Everett, the bassist, happens to be in Fordham Road. After the tenor solo, there is a section I think of a bit like the fugue in the middle of my song Eugenia, where the rhythm section disappears and it's just the horns playing in counterpoint. However, this one gets way crazier way more quickly, and I don't have enough hands to play it on the piano. But it's basically a transition back to the final statement of the opening riff. Then for the ending, I took some inspiration from Watcher of the Skies by Genesis, where there's a rhythmic thing that they play at the end, alternating between really soft and really loud. And the very last thing is one of my favorite musical devices, especially for comic effect, the false start. So that is how I wrote my entire final recital. A power ballad with a samba and a fugue in the middle, a Thelonious Monk ripoff, a genuine samba, a bit of jazz fusion, a standard type ballad, a rock song, and whatever the hell this is. Again, I want to thank the entire band, Lo, Aura, who I do consider part of the band, Daniel, Ian, Sam, Paul, Suzuko, Gabe, Joe Everett, Joe Sprunt, and Robert Mantz. I want to thank you all for putting in your time and probably busting your asses learning Shweeska Shwee. I want to work again with each and every one of you, no matter how varying the degrees of likelihood our paths will cross are, but the internet is a powerful thing. And for the rest of you, I want to thank you all for watching my videos this far. Your support does mean a lot to me, even if I forget to say so as often as I should. There will definitely be more SoundMind vlogs in the future, although I have no idea when. For now, I'm just going to keep posting songs and the occasional album review. So until next time, go forth and follow what you are, be what you follow, and of course, be awesome.